Hello, you're watching Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Joo-han. Protests have been erupting across Iran following the death of a young Kurdish woman arrested by the morality police who claimed she hadn't been wearing her headscarf properly. Now, groups of women are burning their hijabs and cutting their hair in the streets of Iran as a form of defiance against a regime that has since 1979 required all women to cover their hair and has controlled the way they dress and conduct themselves in public. As Iranian protesters continue to call for women, life and freedom, human rights organisation Iran Human Rights says that at least 215 people have been killed as a result of the government's violent crackdown. But the demonstrations continue and have also sparked protests worldwide in support of the women in Iran. And today we discuss the latest developments with Kourosh Ziabari, Asia Times journalist, and Dr. Joo-han, visiting researcher in the Institute of Middle East Studies at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies here in South Korea. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And, well, let's begin with you, Kourosh. Now, the death of the 22-year-old woman, Mahsa Amini, that's caused widespread anger in Iran. And it was actually really a tipping point for many women in the country. What has the demonstrations really turned into? What are they currently about now?
The protests that actually started the 16th of September after the tragic death of the
sorry, Kourosh, we're having a little bit of a trouble. We're having some trouble hearing you properly. Perhaps we could try and readjust your audio. And in the meantime, let me go to you, Professor Lee. The headscarf, now known as the hijab, it's now become the center of controversy in Iran, the center of the protests. And why is it an especially inflammatory issue in the country? Why is the government responding as it is?
Since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the Iranian government has been operating on the basis of Velat Faqih, which means the guardianship of the Islamic jurists. The first Supreme Leader was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and the current Supreme Leader is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. In other words, the Iranian government is based on Islamic identity. Therefore, women's hijab wearing is not just a matter of dress. Rather, it is linked to the identity of the Iranian government. In this context, the Iranian government is taking a strong stance against the protest. One of the protest slogans of Iranian women is "No hijabs, no oppression, only equal rights." From the point of view of the Iranian government, if these women's protests are not taken seriously, the government could face a crisis. Of course, Mahsa's death was not the only cause of the protest. This includes Iran's economic problems caused by international sanctions.
And now, Kourosh, if we can try and get you back on the line again. Now, back to what these string of protests in Iran have really become about. These women, these very brave women protesting against the government. What are the issues here that we're looking at?
The trigger of the protest has been grievance against the government's violent recourse to morality police and other means to enforce on women their lifestyle, what they should wear, how they should appear in public, and how should they manifest their identity. But over time, it turned out that the protest is more widespread, more extensive. People are making more radical demands. They are actually urging the government to grant them greater freedoms. And honestly, this is at some point turning out to be a demand, a protest against the entirety of the establishment, with some people in so many university campuses on the streets calling for regime change. So basically, this started with a tragic death of a 22-year-old young woman who was perceived to have been through a period of injustice, to have faced excessive force, and then in the surroundings, in her city, in her small city of Saqqez, people took to the streets to voice their resentment, to voice their frustration. This has spread to the entire country, and now, as encapsulated in the motto of the entire movement, women, life, freedom, actually young people, young Iranians from all walks of life are asking for their basic rights, which includes the right to decide their lifestyle, their preferences, their dressing, and other personal choices, which over time have been encroached on by the government. People are seeing that some of their basic decisions are being dictated by the leadership. So they are not entirely in control of their lives, of their preferences, of how they want to craft a future for themselves. We have been seeing that a new wave of immigration from Iran is emerging, with many young people expressing their desire to move out of the country because they're seeing that with the repressive methods that have been used to quell and quash the protests, and with the internet blackout that has been in place for nearly a month now, people are seeing their space for expression of their views, their sentiments, their desires is shrinking. Their space for the expression of their social identity is shrinking. And actually, the options for people to prosper, to see that their future is brighter than today, the options are pretty much limited these days. So I believe this movement is actually representative of the desires and collective wishes of the Iranian people. It hasn't, I mean, regardless of the outcome, it's pretty much reminiscent of what we saw in the Arab world in the early 2010s with Arab Spring. It's pretty much the same nature, the same sort of expression, the same sort of mobilization that is happening. And in some ways, I can compare it to the Black Lives Matter movement that emerged in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, the African-American man who was killed by a Minnesota police officer. People perceived injustice, police brutality, and now the same pattern is happening in Iran, with people perceiving excessive force being unleashed by the morality police and unpopular force of the Iranian law enforcement agency. And this perceived injustice and the persistent pattern of discrimination that the Iranian women have been through over these years, and the fact that they are seeing their rights are not enshrined, their rights are not respected, including their right to choose their dressing, but it can be extended to many other social realms. This has triggered this massive movement that we are seeing now is extending it to its second month.
And Kourosh, well, protests also took off in Iran in 2009, 2017 and 2019 as well. So what makes those happening now different to those previous ones?
All right, so the protests in 2009, 2017, and 2019 were mostly incentivized by people's grievances over economic issues, rising inflation, declining purchasing power, and other economic hardships that people have been facing, especially exacerbated by the international sanctions that have been imposed on Iran. But this time around, the protests have a totally different nature. I mean, it's entirely sparked by people's perception of the shrinking of civil liberties, social rights, individual freedoms. This is an entirely cultural uprising in which people are demanding a different spectrum of rights that were trampled over these years. So I guess one of the characteristics of this movement is that people this time are not unhappy about the fact that they cannot pay their bills, or they should, for example, buy poultry and meat at the triple price in the market. They are making fundamental demands. And this time, it's not only the urban middle-class Iranians that are involved in the protests. The entire country is implicated. People from impoverished areas, remote areas, far-flung, rural areas, all of them are getting together, joining forces with Iranians in urban areas, in larger cities, in the capital. The entire country is implicated, even though there haven't been very massive protests in terms of number of demonstrators, but the protest is still ongoing as a movement, as an uprising. This means people are all concerned, and especially women. The leadership role of the women is crucial and central to what's happening now. Women have been taking the center stage. They have been leading the movement in some way. And this time, what has been somewhat kind of concealed or marginalized, which is women's rights and demands and freedoms, is now being highlighted. And the entire world is talking about how Iranian women are demanding their rights, their freedoms, their entitlement to choose what they want to wear, which is apparently happening in so many Muslim countries in the world surrounding Iran and beyond.
Exactly.
It's only Iran that is finding it so difficult to come to an accommodation with the concept of hijab. And unfortunately, this is turning to be a social fault line. But still, I guess this movement is pretty much dynamic in terms of the involvement of so many Iranians from different strata of the population, and also the leadership role of the women who have been actually running the movement from the beginning.
Right, really it's spotlighting the rights of Iranian women, and it's garnering a lot of support all over the world. And Professor Lee, now how has life been for women in Iran since the 1980s that are calling for liberty, no headscarves and no oppression?
You know, before the Islamic Revolution, the Pahlavi dynasty rather banned women's hijab wearing and implemented a reform policy known as the White Revolution. However, the excessive pro-American policy and westernization policy of the Pahlavi dynasty aroused antipathy among the Iranian people. And this is one of the causes of the Islamic Revolution. After the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran became an anti-American state. Since then, the United States and Iran have continued to maintain conflict relations to this day. The Iranian government is based on Islamic identity, so therefore women's hijab wearing is compulsory. But this does not mean that the Iranian government prevents women from engaging in social activities. Rather, women's university enrollment rates are very high in Iran. So I think women's social activities are also the most active among Middle Eastern countries. So Iran is currently experiencing economic hardship due to international sanctions. And this has led to an increase in the unemployment rate for women. So the current Iranian protests include these complex issues.
And Kourosh, just before we go, now what is your reaction as a journalist to these protests, and what kind of questions do you still have about them as we see these protests continue to proceed?
I'm sorry, but I didn't hear the question. I'm having a bit of difficulty hearing you. If you can.
Sure. So right before we go, just wondering what your reaction is to these protests as a journalist, and what question you still have about them as we see these protests continue to proceed.
Right. I think, I mean, the movement is leading in a way that is going to be conducive to long-term change and transformation, be it the revocation of the morality police or the relaxation of the strict hijab mandate. But what we know for sure is that life today in Iran and the months to come will not look like what actually it looked like in the run-up to the tragedy of the death of Mahsa Amini. So I guess we are talking about an inflection point that has changed the nature of social interactions. Many protesters on the streets of Tehran and other large cities are not happy to listen to other voices anymore. They just want their demands and rights to be granted. And I guess the international solidarity with this movement should be crafted in such a way that it does not play into the hands of those radicals and hardliners who wish to insinuate that these protesters are supported or financed or funded by hostile governments that want to overthrow the Iranian government. There should be a very delicate and subtle reaction in terms of solidarity. The fact that media are giving coverage to these protests, the fact that the voices of Iranian women are being reflected, the fact that stories from individual Iranians are being narrated and reflected in international media, and also human rights organizations are speaking out. These are essential and these are important. And I believe that leaders, especially the leaders of Western countries, should be very much prudent in terms of how they put together their rhetoric and their talking points. They should be very much careful in terms of what they say, so that this does not create the impression that this is a foreign-led movement. This is an entirely homogeneous movement that is, born out of Iran. It's being led by the Iranian people. And I believe that more countries, including Iran's closer allies in the Persian Gulf region and other countries in the Muslim world, should also express solidarity with the Iranian people and call on the Iranian government to actually exercise restraint, refrain from the use of excessive force, and show a realistic and pragmatic reaction to what's happening instead of cracking down. We should be careful not to give this movement that is very authentic a chance to plunge into something that can be deviated from its original path, that is the authentic desires and wishes of the Iranian people being reflected. And by that I mean that especially Western countries should be very much careful in terms of how they craft their narrative and how they react, because there are still voices, radicals, hardliners, fundamentalists ready, prepared to hijack this movement and portray it as an entirely Western-led rioting or uprising, while this is simply a movement that is the outcome of the Iranian people's struggles for freedom and equality. And obviously we know that more than 1 year of rabble-rousing and agitprop by the Raisi administration on the idea of compulsory hijab, increased investment in morality police, investment in different religious entities and initiatives that actually propped up this idea of morality hijab and compulsory hijab, and reinvigorated pressure on women in the public spaces, has resulted in the current stalemate. But this is where we are now, and we should be
and as you said,
first careful about how to approach this movement, and also we should appreciate the value that lies in it in terms of its reflection of the desires of Iranian women.
We are, as you said, at this critical inflection point, and I'm afraid this is where we're going to have to wrap up this interview today. That was Kourosh Ziabari, Asia Times journalist, and Dr. Joo-han, visiting researcher at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul. Thank you both so much for your time today. Thank you also to our viewers for tuning in. Global Insight will be back at the same time tomorrow. Do tune in then. Have a great day wherever you are. Goodbye.